My name is Kay Wellman, and I have been a member of the Chagrin Valley Quilt Guild since the 1990s. Needless to say, I'm fairly passionate about quilts. So hopefully I can tell you something today about this display at the Chagrin Falls Historical Society. To get us started, you might want to know, what is a quilt? Moving around a little bit. So a quilt is a sandwich. It has a top piece. The middle piece is called either batting or wadding, and the back piece. Now, as with many other things, there are exceptions to the rule that I'll point out along the way. One of the many questions that people ask about quilts is, how do I know if it's hand-stitched, hand-quilted, or machine-quilted? So one of the ways is that hand quilting has stitch, space, stitch, space, and you can definitely see that. With machine quilting, the stitches come together and almost look like a solid line, but you can see that there are stitches because that's the way the machine works. It doesn't skip a space, it just keeps stitching up and down, up and down. So if there are spaces, it's done by hand. If there are no spaces, it's done by machine. So one of the quilts, a category of quilts here at the Historical Society, are these penny quilts. And they were called that because somebody could go, I'm not quite sure where, whether it was to a store or an organization, and buy each square for a penny. They would get a square that had a blue outline of something on it. And then they would use an outline stitch to do most of the embroidery. So the outline stitch shows where you take a stitch, you back up halfway, take another stitch, so each stitch overlaps by about half a stitch. And that, carefully done, it makes a straight line. There are also other embroidery stitches that are used, such as French knots, buttonhole, various different ones. So these were not always done in red. Sometimes they were also done in a dark blue. So as you can see, many different figures. Possibly these were some Beatrix Potter ones, were represented in the squares. The, The back of this is only quilted at the edge of the squares, along what is called the sashing. You can see this has been machine stitched along the sashing. This example has more of a political theme to it, but here again would be indicated as penny squares, and possibly they would pay the penny to the political party that was handing out these squares, and they would raise money in that way. So here again, you have a lot of outline stitch. This is all done in chain stitch. And here again, it might also be done in blue and not just red. This one has not been made into a quilt. So you can see, here's an example of the stitch and space, that it has been hand sewn together. So another way of using embroidery is to fasten one piece, the term is applique, one piece to another piece. So this has used a buttonhole stitch The individual veins in this Dresden plate were sewn together by hand, but then they were sewn also by hand onto the background. And needless to say, the words, the names were also stitched and embroidered by hand. So just another example of how embroidery is used.